Hello there and welcome to the project video. If you're watching this, you must be my art history professor or someone else who thought that watching an hour-plus video about painting rocks would be a good idea. Let's see if I can survive wearing headphones long enough to record this. If you'd like to skip to any other parts of the process, please consult the starting page and possibly the description for timestamps. So my project is to sort of recreate, sort of imitate prehistoric cave art, and I decided that in order to do this I would go out, find some rocks to grind into paint, and then process them into pigments by hand. It's impossible to be perfectly historically accurate at the best of times, and especially impossible to be historically accurate to something prehistoric. But I wanted to make my own actual rock pigments because it would give me more insight into the processes that prehistoric people would have used, and because buying paint from the store would feel very, very cheap. Upcoming is the first... well, you'll see.
This is the kind of rock that they use to make their spaceships out of.
What kind of rocks do you need?
I need ones that can be ground into pigment, so small ones ideally, soft ones ideally.
Alright, let me come around this turn.
Did I mention I brought my family with me? So, I got my dad to take me and my siblings up a canyon. I think it's Cottonwood Canyon. We're looking for rocks amidst the gravel that falls into the road, which my dad assures us is ethical enough because someone would remove and dump it somewhere else eventually anyway. The only footage I have from these expeditions is the time we went to this slate deposit, and a bunch of out-the-window driving views. Browns, grays, my brother on a mountain. Wait, where's Becca? Oh. Okay.
What again?
So,
How do the rocks taste? Are they good?
I'm tempted. Taste the rock. Joseph, will you give me money if I lick this?
I'll give you a high five.
Alright. Tastes like my opinion of the Salt Lake Valley. Here you go.
wait, this is light. Hold on, read it. Okay.
Hey, I got a
Yes.
second sheet.
Yes.
Yes, I do. Where did he go?
So that joke my brothers made about tasting the rocks, that's what we in the storytelling business like to call foreshadowing. If you'd like to guess what I end up doing much later in the video, or if you'd like to go back to the title screen and just read and find the timestamp and skip to that part, it's probably funnier than some of the jokes we were making in earlier parts of this video.
Careful, you might get stabbed.
Icicles are such a frequent video game mechanic, it's kind of insane.
If I get killed by a falling
The
icicle,
water and the ice is awesome.
give my friends high fives for me and tell them it was what I really wanted.
Except that joke. My younger brother is fire.
Stance. Oh my gosh.
The kind of rocks that we're looking for. We're looking for clay-like dirt, or, dirt with clay content, because that is very easy to turn into a pigment of some sort, and also the kind of thing they would have actually been using way back when. We're also looking for soft rocks. Or not soft, but like grindable, you know? And then hematite and ochre, but I don't know if we would be able to. Those are like very good pigment rocks, but I don't know if we'd be able to identify those. I did find some nice white and pink ones though.
Ochre is a color.
No, ochre is a type of rock.
Well, no, but it's also a color.
It is a color, but there's like yellow ochre, red ochre, brown ochre, not
There's
burnt.
also just regular ochre.
Yes, it's named after the rock.
If it's yellow ochre, would it just be yellow ochre?
I second this.
Anyways, the most common, what's it? don't know if this video is going to be usable whatsoever, but the most common pigments found in like cave paintings are red and black. Possibly because those are the main colors they were using, possibly because those are just the colors that lasted the longest. Because there are traces, there is like yellow and orange and brown too.
What are the red and black made of?
Black, usually stuff like charcoal, because that's very easy to get, you have fire, you have black. There's also like dark rocks. Red is, it was usually sort of a darker red, not like bright red or anything. So it is entirely possible that they used blood for some of that. Editing note, I should have mentioned that they mostly use red rocks, not blood. They would probably not have been using that much blood all the time. I just got distracted thinking about blood and bones and other things, as is my God-given right. I don't know what happened to the audio in that last segment, but at least I got the subtitles in before it deleted itself somehow. Next up, we have the rock cleaning process. I looked up a bunch of videos during my research stages of this project, some for the history and science, a lot just so I could learn how to turn rocks into pigment in the first place. And I'll link all those videos in the description, but one thing that all the pigment mixing videos mentioned was cleaning the rocks before grinding them. I'm sure that in prehistoric times, people would have wanted to remove excess dirt and impurities before using them too. Though maybe less so if the dirt and impurities were also the desired color. The people who painted the caves in places like Chauvet weren't novices like, I am. They knew what they were doing, and they most likely had traditions going back generations to make sure their descendants continued to know what they were doing. I'm not going to unpack the structure of that sentence. The point is, those people probably wouldn't have spent a bunch of time painstakingly washing slate and granite when they were trying to go for things that they could turn into pigments. I filmed this whole cleaning part not just for the process and for admitting my mistakes, but mostly because I wanted some footage to ramble over the top of. I don't actually end up using most of these rocks, even the ones that aren't slate. I just didn't feel the need, I guess, didn't have the time. Anyways, I said I was going to be rambling, and oh, just a moment, we can see in this part that I am scrubbing at the rock with the scrubber thing, and rubbing the pigment off onto my hand, which is a thing that one of the videos said to do to test whether a rock is usable as pigment. I should have done that with most of these before taking them home with me. Anyways, it's time for the backstory monologue. To touch on why I wanted to do this project with a sort of recreation, sort of interpretation of cave art, we have to jump back a few semesters to when I was taking an anthropology course. For my final in that class, I watched the documentary Cave of Forgotten Dreams, which is about Chauvet Cave, and I cannot emphasize how much that film was. Cave of Forgotten Dreams hits right in the humanity. after watching it, I had dreams about that cave, and the paintings, and the ideas of early humans, and just all of those concepts for weeks, and I still get emotional about it. The other cave paintings are amazing, too, and I get emotional about them, too. I get emotional about a lot of human things from the present and from history. But Chauvet is the one cave that I got perhaps unusually attached to. Or perhaps a normal amount of attached to, considering that I've met several other people who also get emotional about these kinds of things. I knew that we would probably touch on this in the art history course. And who knows, maybe it would have been a better idea to choose a project about a more well-documented style or method or artwork, but you've got to understand. I think about Chauvet Cave, I get any opportunity to do something related to it, and I just go absolutely bonkers for that. There are no words, is what I'm saying. But there have to be at least a few words, because as much as this project was for the passion, I also do need to have a grade for it, and I'd like it to be a passing grade. So I need to come up with words to try to articulate how much it means to me, at least, even if other people looking at the product wouldn't fully understand everything that went into it unless I explained it to them. I suppose that might make this video, required watching material before one can look at the final products for the paintings. I won't actually require it, though. I don't want to give people too much homework. Especially not after how merciful the professor has been on the homework front in this semester. Coming up is something that I apparently decided was a great idea to leave in, which is the tea break interlude, in which I go outside, pluck a bunch of leaves, mint leaves, if you can identify those, and turn them into tea, because I wanted to be hydrated while I was grinding the rocks. I think I wanted to keep this part in because, I don't know, it made me think about what prehistoric people would have been eating and drinking. Like, there are so many things that you can just walk up to a plant and grab the leaves or the flowers or the fruits off of it and just eat it right off the plant, which, you know, I do sometimes do with those mint leaves out there. But there's also the possibility of turning the plants into an infusion or a stew or something, and people in prehistoric times probably also did that. They definitely also did that. They weren't idiots, and they had fire, and they had plants. So I'm just thinking about, would the people who painted those in Chauvet and the other caves, would the people who painted those have just... was there any kind of fasting process? Was there any kind of special food or drink that they would have brought with them or eaten or consumed just before going in? There's no way to tell, because it happened so long ago and there's no... It's a miracle that the caves themselves survived. It's not actually a miracle, it's a perfectly explainable scientific fact, but it does feel very miraculous. And there are some people who would say that miracles are just when scientific and other things line up in just the perfect way. And here is the second beverage that I decided to make during this process, which is spiced milk, except, with oat milk and honey. And a blend of spices that is distinctly modern. Not only because there are so many of them in such manufactured forms, but also because I also put vanilla extract into this later on, as if it wasn't, you know, mad decadent enough for the time period that I'm studying. So rest assured that I was hydrated while grinding all of these rocks. Anyway, back to the narration. We will be getting back on track with the meaningful discussion in a moment. I just want to say a little bit about the process I used here. It turns out that some of the slate, granite, whatever those rocks are that I couldn't grind into pigment, some of them did turn out useful. First, as you can see, to hold down the wax paper I was doing this grinding on. I don't actually use the hammer. I don't know why I'm showing it to the camera right now. Get that thing out of my sight. Thank you. Thank you. Now, these, you can see I select a nice flat rock from the selection of useless ones, and then I select one that fits nicely into my hand, and I'm striking them together to make sure that they're of a similar hardness, and neither one will grind up white or that weird light brown into the pigments that I'm trying to grind. They did leave a tiny bit of a mark on each other, but that's just because I slammed them together. They end up working out very well for the actual grinding. That actually brings me to wonder, the ancient people who made those paintings probably had a few. The ancient people who made those cave paintings probably already had all of the side supplies that they needed to make and mix and use all this paint. They probably had some highly ideal rocks for grinding, and some other shallow dishes for the rest of this processing process that you'll see me go into later. I had to walk up a canyon and find these by myself, but the people who made the paintings probably didn't need to do that. Unless, of course, that was part of some kind of ritual process that they did before going in and actually painting, or part of their training or practice or what have you. It's possible that several generations of artists used the same tools, because rocks don't exactly degrade as quickly as, say, ceramic or wood might, that we might use. Well, we probably wouldn't use wood to grind things, and I really shouldn't be grinding on the wooden table right here. The point is, I don't really know what the point is. This is my process video, and that includes my thought processes, even those thought processes that don't have a satisfying conclusion in a narration or monologue sense. It just makes me wonder about a lot of things, because these were human people, and they did what they knew how to do, and they would have improved their processes whenever possible, but they would have stuck to what worked. And what seems to work for me is finding the soft rocks and grinding them up between two harder rocks, which, you know, it makes a lot of sense that that's probably how they would have done it too, considering that soft rocks and harder rocks to grind them between have always been available. But did they grind them dry? Did they get them wet before grinding them? Did they get the grinding stone wet? Did they do this in a shallow pool of water in a bigger, much, much bigger rock? I didn't actually manage to test whether grinding them inside of water would make any difference, but I feel like it could, especially considering the processing that I'll get into later. Have I already said that? I'd actually like to go back to what I was saying about the people who made those paintings being human. They had their own reasons for doing it, their own processes, and there's no way for us to fully understand anything about that process. I know my project can't have the same significance, the same meaning. Heck, it can't even be made of the same materials as theirs, because they painted those walls millennia in the past, and they used things that I cannot physically replicate, because a lot of the stuff they used was found in France and I live in Utah. But, aside from that, they had an understanding of the world that I can't do more than guess at. And they made those paintings for reasons that even the greatest historian can do no more than guess about. And I'm not the greatest historian. I have a lot of feelings about Chauvet Cave, and I'm a human, and they were human, but That's actually a good point. They were human, and they painted with the best things they had available to paint with a skill that speaks to practice and experimentation and improvement. Even if we have no records of that part, we only have the paintings and what we can assume. But they were human, and I'm a human, and I'm trying to paint something that they might recognize as based off of their paintings. But what I make is not as meaningful because I don't know what the meaning is. And it's not as skilled because I don't have generations of tradition and possibly years of practice behind me. But if one of those prehistoric painters were able to look at whatever I end up making and they recognized it, even if it was just in the way someone might vaguely recognize a 5-year-old's attempt at recreating The Last Supper, I would absolutely be moved to tears on the spot. I would probably already be in tears if I were able to interact with one of the prehistoric painters in the first place. If someone gave me a time machine and a universal translator, that's where I would go. All the rest of history has been recorded, but this is something that nobody can go into detail about. It's simultaneously a complete and utter enigma to human understanding, while also being something extremely understandable to just about anyone who understands what a human is. Whatever their purpose was, whatever their understanding of what they were doing was, however skilled they were, however much tradition was behind it, it's such a human thing to find something that makes a color when you smash it, grind it, process it somehow, or even just grab the rock and draw with it like chalk, although they didn't do that in those paintings. You can imagine that their kids probably did on rocks that were outside and ended up getting weathered away. It's just, what was I saying? It is such a distinctly human thing to find these colors, find these caves where they won't get weathered away, and draw on the walls. Paint on the walls. Just put the color up, and it has some kind of meaning to whoever's putting it up, or whoever's finding it. It has so much meaning to us millennia after it was created, and we have no idea what any of it originally meant. So imagine how much meaning it could have had to the people who put it there, who knew what they were doing. And this isn't the kind of thing you do on accident, or just for fun, or just because you wanted to make the cave walls look nice. I'm sure they did do those sorts of things, sometimes, but this is such a big dedication of time and effort and It's just not the sort of thing you do on a whim. Even if it was just someone who wanted to make some cave walls look pretty, they put a lot of effort into that. I think I'm about to talk in the video, just a second. Pro tip, if it might make your mom mad at you, don't do it. Unless you want your mom to be mad at you, in which case, absolutely do it. Right, as you could see, I had been grinding directly on the surface of the table, and then I got someone to hand me a cutting board. A wooden one, but a cutting board, so that if I am messing something up, I'm messing something up that was meant to have knives on it anyway. Something else might be about to happen. Ah, just ASMR. What was I saying? This can't have been an accident, because you'll see how long this rock grinding part is, even after I've sped up a lot of it. And I only grind up about a handful of rocks. Not nearly enough to make one of those massive cave paintings. However many rocks I actually collected, I only end up grinding a handful of them. And it looks like quite a solid pile of rock dust right there, but the amount of pigment that's actually in that pile is very, very small. So all this effort, all these rocks I collected and went through and figured out which ones weren't grindable and which ones were, and which ones were a color that I wanted and which ones weren't. All that effort isn't something you do unless you feel strongly about what you're going to make. You have to feel some sort of passion, some sort of meaning in whatever you're going to use all this pigment on, because this pigment is the result of a lot of time and a lot of effort. And, you know, there's a phenomenon that one of my friends likes to call the artist crab arm, which is referring to the fact that a lot of crabs have one bigger front claw and one much smaller front claw. And a lot of artists who use their dominant hand a lot have a much stronger dominant arm than their non-dominant arm. And this is sort of a silly thought that I just thought of while narrating. I might not even keep it in. But the thought that in prehistoric times, given that an artist was grinding their own pigment using their dominant hand, and hunting and gathering and making whatever else with their dominant hand, and then painting with that dominant hand, they probably had the same quote-unquote artist crab arm strength. And as we can see here, I am staying hydrated while doing all of this grinding. Allow me to pause the narration for a moment and do the same on this end. Allow me to pause the narration for a moment and allow me to do the same on this end of the process. There, now aren't you glad I didn't make a lot of loud, obnoxious slurping noises directly into the narration microphone? I might not keep that part in, actually. Now, if I wanted a truly fine rock dust powder here, These rocks are honestly soft enough that I could probably have used the ceramic and wood mortar and pestle that we have in the kitchen. But I doubt that people in prehistoric times had ceramic and wood mortars and pestles to grind their rocks with. They probably mostly had other rocks, and other rocks are the only things in nature that are guaranteed to be harder than some other rocks, and therefore possible to be used for grinding them. One reason I didn't end up using that hammer that you can still see on the side there is that, well, it's an extremely modern hammer. And by extremely modern, I mean modern. I think hammers have mostly been roughly the same size and shape for a very long time. But the hammers they would have had back then would probably have just been other rocks. I've been thinking about rocks an unusual amount of the time while working on this project. I have a little bit of a confession to make. I did not actually oversee the foraging and gathering of the rocks that I ended up using as my main pigments. These sort of almost sandy, probably clay-based red rocks were chef's kiss. They were beautiful. Look at that rich color. I don't know how well it shows up on screen, but in person, this was a beautiful shade of red and incredibly edible looking rock dust. That's more foreshadowing, if you caught my earlier joke about foreshadowing and what I will later do with these rocks. And here we see a slightly closer to the camera water pouring ASMR, where you can actually kind of see what I'm doing a little bit better. Because my brain is convinced that anything of that rough level of texture and coloring and just visual quality, my brain is convinced that it must be edible. So when I poured it into this water, half of me expected it to just dissolve like one might dissolve strawberry milk powder into a liquid of their choice, but it is in fact rock dust, so instead of doing that, it formed a sort of thick rocky paste at the bottom, although the pigment did mix very well into the water in the red one. Another thing about this sort of repetitive grinding work is that it leaves a lot of time for the mind to wander, or a lot of time to hold conversations with, or talk, or listen to other people. Would this have been a community event, or would this have been something that the painters did by themselves, or something that groups of just painters did together, or something that someone else did before giving the pigment to the painter? Like I said, I have a lot of thoughts about these things, and the rock grinding gives a lot of time to ponder those thoughts. It also gives time to ponder more practical or tangible things, like what I believe is about to come up in another dialogue clip. It also gives time to ponder more practical, tangible things, like what I believe is about to come up. These rocks are so soft that I'm not certain they aren't literally just sand. Like solidified sand.
Just really old compacted sandstone.
Or dirt. Like, come here. Grab like this and just crush it with your fingers.
That's a really compacted soil. Isn't that what old stone is?
Yeah, you know. And that thought actually just now brought me back into the thought of how involved was the community in this? As far as we're aware, prehistoric people lived in tribes and they functioned in tribal groups. So community would community would have been everything. They would have gathered food for the group, they would have made tools for the group, they would have made clothes for the group, they would have passed any objects they had between themselves. They would have taught each other about everything, maybe, or they would have taught each other about specifically the things that would be useful to them in their given role. Or they would have taught each other about everything they possibly could, because, you know, you never know when someone might die, or I'm hydrating again. Let's do another narration pause, because who would have guessed that trying to talk for over an hour in a voiceover for an hour-and-a-half long video would make you get thirsty? I'm going to take a hydration break again, because who would have guessed that trying to talk for over an hour would make one need to take frequent water breaks? In any case, this is about the time that I don't actually know why I set the bigger grinding rock aside, but I quickly found another smaller one that had a similar workable flat surface on it. I also wonder if the pigment grinding for the cave paintings was done under different circumstances or with different materials than the pigment grinding that they would have done for body paint, or paint that would be intended for an object, or maybe even dyes. It's not that difficult to dye leather by sort of boiling it in pigmented water, and as you can still sort of see in the corner there, that red makes a strong pigment in water, even after it's been given some time to settle. If you'll allow me to get existential again for a moment, which you have no physical way of stopping me from doing so. Well, okay, except my man Travis, who controls my grades, and therefore has the ability to tell me that editing out part of this video will benefit me in some way. If this is how sidetracked I get while talking to literally just myself and my incredibly scuffed recording setup, can you imagine how sidetracked I get in conversations with actual people who can spark even more subject shifts? Actually, this isn't the kind of existential I was intending to get to before. But it's actually great, because now I'm thinking about how those Paleolithic people would have had language and conversations, and hey, maybe some of them even had some prehistoric edition of ADHD and were simultaneously hilarious and very annoying to hold a conversation with. Not that I would know anything about that, haha. The fact that they made this art indicates that they were capable of what might be referred to as higher thought, or what I might refer to as abstract thought, because I'm pretty sure that's the term my anthropology professor used. Abstract thought is one of those things that sets humans apart from other creatures. It's the ability to interpret more, understand more than what is literally right in front of you. It's abstract. And now I'm having feelings about language and the fact that I can say the word abstract and get across such an abstract meaning as the concept of something being abstract. And I wonder if they would have had a word for that too, or if they would have needed a word for that. I say they had abstract thought, but there's no way for me to know what was important to them to be able to communicate. I just remembered why I set that rock aside. It's because it was wet. As you can see here, I have put a tiny piece of slate on it, and I'm going to try to chip off a piece of the slate. There's a tiny piece right there. I don't know if it's visible on the camera, but I'm attempting to grind it, and then I'm going to show it to the camera so you can see the fruits of my science. As you can see, that tiny black speck with that streak behind it it actually dug into the white rock that I was grinding on. It is a harder rock, so it would not be usable as a pigment, so I set it aside. The council will decide your fate. Okay, I'm going to explain a little bit of this process before I get back to that existential train of thought. So what I do is I pour the rock dust into the water, mix it up. Had to pause for the ASMR. I mix it up and let the heaviest parts settle over the course of several minutes. Then I pour out the pigment-saturated water, leaving the heavier, darker, more dirt and too thick to paint with pigment, well, rock dust, in the bottom of the jar. There was only a tiny bit of that yellow stuff, and don't get attached to it because it's not... I don't actually end up using the yellow, and I barely end up using any of this brown, because if you saw that tiny, tiny brown rock that I was grinding with, there was not nearly enough of it to make a significant amount of pigment out of. I probably could if I did it the intended way, which would take several weeks of evaporating. So, okay. The way that most of my research places... Okay, this one that I just poured is my dad used 2 hammers to grind some of the greenish, grayish slate into a fine powder. And I figured that I didn't get that on video because he did it and I wasn't there. But I figured that I would attempt to dry it out the way I do with the rest of it, because nothing ventured, nothing gained. It's science. I'll at least be able to explain why it didn't work. And you can see that I took several seconds to properly arrange everything. Now, this is happening the next day, I believe, after they've been given some time to evaporate. The original way that this was meant to be done, as far as I saw in videos, was that you would pour out the pigment-saturated lighter part of the water and just leave it in a dish to evaporate. Unfortunately, that method would take several weeks, probably. Although we do live in Utah and it is a desert, so it's possible that it would not have taken as long. However, as you can see, I am incredibly impatient, and I decided that, you know, coffee filters might be able to catch some of that pigment. You can see some of my trial and error in this process with this first jar I tried pouring into was way too small, and I had to switch it out for a bigger one and figure out a way to make sure the coffee filters would stay on. I definitely could have just left them there. I could have just left the coffee filters sort of folded over the edge of the jar, and they would have stayed put. I know this because I did it off camera and it stayed perfectly fine. And that's because the coffee filters, well, they're very thick, very stiff paper. Even while wet, they're very stiff. Comparatively stiff compared to thin paper. So while they're wet, they sort of cling, and then once they dry, they sort of hold themselves in place with all those folds and such. I don't know if that's necessary for the coffee filtering process, or if that's just the kind of paper that they're made out of. I don't know anything about coffee, but I do know things about rock dust. And let me tell you, those things do not capture nearly enough of the pigment. The first one I do is the yellow one, because even at this point I was under no illusions that I would actually be able to use it. So I was sort of using it as my test. I was sort of using it as my test subject, I guess. Test substance. So once I figured out how to sort of make the yellow one work, I would go on to work with the actual top performers and my beautiful, beautiful babies, mostly the red one and kind of the brown one, because the brown one did actually process very well, there just wasn't that much of it. Now, I imagine that the way people would have done this in prehistoric times would use the evaporation method, both because they didn't have glass jars and coffee filters, although they might have had some sort of textile or animal membrane that might be able to filter. You know, now that I think about it, if there is some kind of animal membrane organ thing that would actually allow this kind of filtration process, they might have used that. That would have been clever as heck. Now, as you can see with this, I'm sort of shaking the pigment back and forth. That's because it keeps settling. Because I'm not sure if you remember this, but this is in fact rock dust, and rocks in water like to go downwards. They don't like to stay suspended. And if I were going for a very, very fine pigment, I would actually want more of the thick stuff to sort of settle in the bottom, but I did not have nearly enough pigment to go for a very fine kind of it. And I am also very impatient, so I wasn't about to triple filter this stuff. I'm also pretty sure that, actually, now that I think about it, would the cave painters of the ancient times, would they have made pigment in very large batches and used some of it and just gone back to the stuff that they already made? Because it's rock dust, it's not gonna go bad. The worst thing that could happen is it gets scattered or blows away or something in wind. Would they have made it in very large batches and saved it and added to that batch over time? Or might they have gone out and gotten just enough for whatever painting they were about to do and used it right away? For a more stationary society, it would make a lot more sense for them to do it in large batches and just save it, but for a more traveling type of nomadic, that's the word I was looking for, nomadic. If they were more nomadic or semi-nomadic, it might have made more sense to do it in small batches when they needed it. Then again, it's rock dust, so maybe large batches, and then they would just stick it in a hole near the cave and come back for it later. There's no way to know. Now, unless I hallucinated part of that narration, I believe that the pigment processing, drying process has been explained adequately enough. Well, hold on, we're actually taking a moment to appreciate how pretty that red is. The brown it's a nice sort of rich brown. The actual pigment ended up darker than that, though I think the paint with that pigment ended up a little lighter than the original rock. But look at how pretty that red is. And the jars all next to each other. Now I'm sure that my man Travis understands some of the slang, so I hope he knows what I mean when I say this is a straight up vibe. Speaking of prehistoric people not understanding a word of what we say, they would probably understand some of the processes, at least the ones that happen on a human level, the ones that you do with your own hands. If a prehistoric person saw this, they would probably not quite get what exactly everything is made out of, but with a little bit of explanation, or maybe sticking their finger into the top of one of those things and pulling it back out with red or yellow or brown on it, they'd probably go, oh, this is pigment. And now, the day of, starting off with some nice tea, so you know that I'm hydrating. Actually, let's have another narration hydration break. As you can see there, I did accidentally let some of the water evaporate. If you saw that glass bowl in the earlier shots, what I ended up doing was I had left it out long enough while waiting for the jars to be usable again, that the pigment all settled and it left a very clear layer of water. So I poured out most of the water and then I left it to sit again. And it only took about 2 days for a much thinner layer of water to fully evaporate out. You can see there is already a little bit of pigment dust in that tiny jar that I'm about to start spoon scraping this one into. And that's because I had several jars, so I decided to experiment with one of them and make sure that that I would actually be able to scrape the pigment out on camera. You see, I have this issue called hubris, where I will often attempt to do something and just assume that it'll come out perfectly correctly the first time I do it on camera, where it usually works much better if I practice doing the thing one more time right before I start filming, and that's what I did, and that's why it's taking comparatively... Well, that's why I'm not spilling pigment all over the counter. I don't know that it's taking less time than it would otherwise have taken. It might be taking more time than it would otherwise have taken, because if I did this wrong, I might have accidentally stabbed through the coffee filter. But as you can see, that's a nice, it's a decent amount of pigment. That's a little respectable covering along the bottom of that jar. I do have a bit more existential, oh my gosh, humanity stuff that I want to get to, but I know that there is a section of the video coming up. That's going to have noise in it. And I don't like narrating while there is too much background noise. By the way, I have taken mercy upon all of your ears, Travis and other people who might be listening. Mostly yours, Travis, because I feel like if I let that horrible metal on rock dust on glass, loud shriek, nails on chalkboard sound, I feel like if I let you hear that, you would have docked me at least 10 points, and I probably wouldn't even be able to be mad because that sound was horrible. I had to endure it in real life, but fortunately I figured out how to edit the audio so that you don't have to endure it. Anyway, once I finish scraping this into the jar, I think I'm going to skip the rest of it because, well, we've seen me scrape the red stuff into the jar, we've seen me scrape the red coffee filters out, and we've seen me scrape out this massive bowl, which was pretty satisfying, but I wasn't going to get all that stuff around the rim on camera. I ended up doing that off camera so that you wouldn't have to hear the horrible noise. There's my hydration note, and once again, it was a good idea to leave those beverage interludes in, if only because it would remind me to drink while recording. So these are the rocks that I'm planning on painting on. We went up to the canyon, again, just me and my dad because everyone else was busy on that day. We went up to the canyon again and scoped out more of the road gravel and found some likely little nerds, and I decided to clean them off because we got these off of the ground where they were covered in dirt and rock dust and probably car exhaust, and, well, I'm trying to be a little bit historically accurate, even though it's impossible to be truly historically accurate about anything ever, except stuff that's happening right now in the present. What was I saying? They probably didn't have to clean most of the caves that they painted in, because they would have been painting... First off, a lot of those paintings happened on top of other paintings, and they wouldn't have been, quote-unquote, cleaning off the other paintings. That's just not something they did, and we can tell because they have so many paintings layered on top of each other, and not to sidetrack again, but that creates such an amazing effect. I, unfortunately, was not able to do that because I had very little paint and not a whole lot of, as you can see, these are comparatively pretty small. The actual cave paintings Well, they were done on cave walls. They had so much room. And they would have had way more pigment than I had, but yes, the point is I decided to clean these rocks off using the same dish scrubber that I used on the pigment rocks several days before this happened, or possibly weeks. I don't think I've gotten my sense of time back since the pandemic. Okay, and now they can dry. Here we have me mixing together some... Well, first I feel like I have to explain that that is charcoal, that is not a rock. I realized that I didn't have enough of the brown stuff to make a nice dark base paint, and I didn't want to go grind up a whole bunch of new rocks right before I had decided it was filming day and painting day, so I went to the fireplace, where my mom had started a fire a week or so before, and we are really, really bad about cleaning out our fireplace, but that was great for me because it meant there were a few pieces of charcoal left in there. So I just grabbed all that charcoal, mashed it together. I did not do a filtering process with the charcoal. I just ground it up as well as I possibly could, shoved it through a strainer. A kitchen strainer. Again, I'm using so much kitchen supplies with these rocks. And as you can see, I'm mixing water, not too much water, and a little bit of egg yolk into this paste, I guess. The water makes it, well, mix up a bit better, and the egg yolk acts as a binding agent. It's a protein, and it's, well, you've seen an egg yolk, it's all goopy. It sort of makes the stuff hold together and be a little bit more thick. And if you've ever, say, I don't know, been trying to make a pudding from scratch and you left your egg yolks out a little too long and they all started forming a skin and getting solid and thick and crusty, that is actually a desirable trait in this paint because that means it's going to dry and it's going to sort of adhere to the surface and it's going to adhere to itself. And here I found a random rock, another one of the cast-off slate pieces, which became useful as I decided to use it to test whether this paint would actually stick to a rock. And it did, and that's great. And you can see there I have taken a buffalo picture from Chauvet Cave, and I just sort of sketched onto this paper using a pen because I decided that erasing is illegal because you can't erase rock paint. I sketched using a pen, and then I did a sort of... I didn't trust my ability to just slap this down perfectly on my first try, because I only had one of this rock, and this rock, I don't know if you can see the shape of it properly, but it just, I don't know, I really liked it. It really appealed to me for putting a buffalo onto, and I didn't want to have to go find another rock after I already started painting. So I put an undersketch on with a smaller white rock, and I cover up most of the undersketch, but, you know, that is probably as historically accurate as I can get, because they did, in fact, score marks onto their cave walls. They did some carvings. If I had been more confident in the amount of time and practice I would be able to get for this project, I might have carved something. I might have tried to make one of those little handheld Venus statuettes. But, well, as I've said before, Chauvet Cave, I go nuts for it. I go bonkers for it. It's just, it has so much, humanity. Now, I will admit, while I was doing this, I thought that everything looked really terrible. And not just because it's, you know, it's a different style of animal drawing than we're used to in modern day. It's just that most artists are aware that there is always a point during the process where you just kind of hate it. You feel like you're not doing what you wanted to do or what you thought was good. And I just really, really didn't want to mess up this buffalo. As I said, it was this piece of rock I just really wanted it. I liked the fact that there is a little bit of a gradient to it. On the left it's darker, and on the right it's lighter. And the buffalo that I'm referencing, I'll show a picture of it later in the video. It'll fade in over the final picture of the painting that I did. But that buffalo has darker stuff on the left, on the front of it, and lighter on the back. And, you know, it just wouldn't be the same if I ended up flipping the rock over. Partly because it just wouldn't be the same, and partly because this rock is... the way that it's sitting now on this exterior windowsill, the top of it is much thinner and the bottom of it is much thicker, so if I did try to turn it around, I wouldn't be able to get the same gradient effect. The other side was slightly more chunky as well. Now, as you can see there, I am switching up which finger I'm using because, well, the pinky is the best one for fine lines because it's the smallest finger, obviously, and, you know, other fingers are bigger and more able to blend and fill in large areas at once. There's my face of, I don't think this is going as well as I want it to. And that face I actually made because I did the horn a little bit wrong, and I realized immediately, but you can't erase rock dust on a rock. So I just had to live with it. Now, if I were working with a larger quote-unquote canvas, and if I had a lot more of the pigment, and maybe another rock as a backup that I also really liked the shape and coloration of, I would probably have felt more comfortable trying to, I don't know, you know, I probably would have felt more comfortable trying to do that kind of overlaying, extended, multiple sets of horns thing that you see in all those cave paintings, and especially the ones in Chauvet. But I did not have any of those things, let alone the confidence to try it. So here we have it. Weird horns. One of the other things that I noticed later that I did a little bit wrong was the fading, the shading in the front half. The front half isn't quite big enough compared to the rest, and I think most of this is because I had an imperfect reference, and part of it is also because the way that I was angled compared to my reference and compared to the rock, I was seeing it slightly differently than it was actually turning out, which is another thing that I'm sure many artists have experienced. Now we have a little bit more blending and cringing, and I think in this moment I'm also realizing that there's a little bit wrong with the proportions, but I'm, you know, just going through it. Now, there is only so much of this video left, and there is an entire tangent about humanity and the art and the prehistoric caves, prehistoric people that I really need to go on in this video. I was wondering why are so many of the cave paintings that we have today in Chauvet and other caves, why are all of them animals? Why do all of them focus so heavily on animals? And when humans are depicted, they're little stick guys, or they're only part of a human. Why did they paint these full, beautiful, lovingly detailed images of animals, some of them in motion, but human depictions were fewer, smaller, sometimes more isolated, usually not full body, at least not in the same detailed way as these animals were. It's possible that human art was saved for other things. Maybe it was saved for things that were kept outside or used more often and wouldn't have survived to present day as well as a miraculously preserved cave did. Actually, hold on, I believe dialogue is about to happen.
looks good.
Okay.
It looks like cave painting.
Now, where was I? It's possible that humanoid art was done on things with materials
Looks like cave painting.
that just didn't survive to present day because they, weren't perfectly preserved caves in an incredibly controlled environment. Or maybe they didn't see a need to depict themselves, or maybe they thought there would be some kind of risk if they depicted themselves the same way they did the animals. Maybe all the humanoid or human-related art was done on the humans themselves, with things like body paint, tattoos, clothing, beads, funky hats, etc., and the animals were an entirely separate thing. They wouldn't have even conceived of art the way we do today. So, is it possible to accurately theorize about why they might have done or not done anything? It actually isn't possible to accurately theorize about any of this, because we have absolutely no way of fact-checking. They might have thought differently, they might have communicated differently, seen themselves and the human state of being differently. But our lack of information almost makes it all more meaningful to us now, because as much as we don't know, what we do know is things like they painted. They put a lot of time and effort into things that weren't strictly necessary for survival because they cared about doing those things. They lived together and they cared about each other. They talked and played and ate and slept and they created things and they decorated themselves and they passed knowledge down from generation to generation. They were human. They were so human. And of the many, many things they made, so much of which is lost to erosion and prehistory, some of the things they put their hands on, they ground up and mixed and put into their hands, on their fingers, put into their mouths and applied to these cave walls, some of that survives, and we have it now and we care about it. We care about them. Supposing that some of us could be their distant descendants, they probably cared about us, in a way, even though our world is so different from theirs. Did I mention the whole getting emotional about early humans thing? Some of this narration was actually partially scripted, and I legitimately cried while writing that part, because when I said there are no words, what I mean is there are no words that will adequately represent everything about any of this, and there are no words that I can completely get through without crying. I didn't speed up this portion of the video at all, because I wanted an accurate showcase of how long it took me to make this tiny buffalo. It is pretty tiny compared to the ones in the actual caves. Just the thought of how awe-inspiring it would have been to walk into one of those caves, whether as someone who's going to paint, or someone who's going in for a ceremonial reason, or someone who snuck in even though they weren't supposed to. The thought of going in and seeing these big, lovingly painted, powerful, almost in-motion animals on the walls, big, over your head, at eye level with you. Well, I suppose I should say me, because I'm imagining how it might feel to myself if I were to do this. It's just awe-inspiring, even just the thought of it. And this is probably partly just well, I watched Cave of Forgotten Dreams, and the way everything in that documentary, everything in it is framed, all of the background music, the way the narrator goes on about everything, and it's just awe-inspiring, and there's no way I could ever do that justice. But, like I said before, well, like I said a couple of minutes ago and sort of got in a little bit of tears about, those people had a vague concept that we, at least in the concept of their descendants, the concept of other humans long in the future with better stuff than them, probably, they cared about us, and if they saw that little bison, it's tiny, it's sort of, I think it's recognizable as at least based on the bison in Chauvet Cave. I would hope that they would recognize it, even if it's just the kind of thing where you see, I don't know, where some grandmother or great-great-grandmother has some sort of piece of art that's important to her, and one of her little tiny great-great-grandkids is using maybe something that she didn't have when she was a kid. Maybe she never had access to vibrantly colored crayons, but she has this thing from her culture or her family that was important to her, and she showed it to that kid, or the kid found it in her room while just snooping around, as kids tend to. And if that kid went and found whatever they could to try to recreate it, and they made it, and it was not quite right, but was somewhat recognizable in the shape or the color or the thing that it was put onto, you know, that thing that little baby 4-year-old crayon drew on a wall is never going to be as important to that great-great-grandmother as the painting or the artifact or whatever it is that the kid tried to base it off of. But I think she would be pretty touched by the fact that that kid tried, that kid thought this thing was important enough to think about or try to replicate in any way. Now, this part, I wanted to do something that was done originally in red. I wanted to use my red pigment to do something that on the cave wall is red, or at least orangish, or at least looks like it was made with red ochre. So I found the red bears, the red cave bears. And you might notice this rock that I currently have stood up, it's got this white, I don't know if I want to call that an impurity or a feature. It has this white feature, and it's sort of crystalline. And I remembered in some of the cave paintings, specifically the ones in, what was the name of it? Is it Altamira? I remembered that some of the caves, the paintings, the animals were positioned over formations in the rock in such a way as to sort of give dimension or give life or contribute to the color behind the outline of the animal. And I got this one because I intended to do something interesting with the white spots. In actuality, all it did was make it difficult enough to paint on with my finger that I ended up making an impromptu little brush out of a leaf stem. And I actually found, I'm going to show it to the camera later, I found that I could make a sort of, you know, like a bubble wand, where it has the loop on the end, and then the handheld part, and then it holds the soapy liquid in the looped end. I don't know if it's just the fact that there's egg yolk in there that makes it viscous enough to hold itself up in a loop, but I made this little brush thing out of a leaf stem that has a little loop on the end, and I twirled the end around itself and tied it in a knot. It did end up coming undone by itself later, but it was able to hold the paint inside the little loop, and it let me get a lot more freedom of movement on this rock, and I was able to get the pigment into the tiny little cracks in that white area. And unfortunately, this is another case of I messed up because of my imperfect reference image and the angle that I was looking at it at. Because it's not completely clear from this, but I'm looking at this rock and that piece of paper from an extreme side angle. Oh, this would be the point where I decided that I did not like how the bear looked, and I wanted to turn around and try again on the less... I wanted to turn it around and try again on the side with less imperfections, the smoother side. And then I believe my camera will cut out before I actually end up finishing this version of the cave bear. But there I go, showing the little bubble wand. The little paint wand. I tried to blow through so you'd be able to see that it is a loop. And it didn't work at first, but there you go. It held a decent amount of paint in it. And it let me paint a lot more and a lot finer lines with more control over the lines without... Oh, my computer ran out of power and cut the camera right there, lol. But please, enjoy the bear. Now, this is leading up to the fun part, which I saved for last, both in real life and in the video, where I'm imagining that the paint will have to have more egg yolk and more water in it relative to the pigment in order for it to survive being put into my mouth and then blown out onto my hand. I did actually pause just to double check after mixing all this pigment that you're about to see. I just wanted to make sure that I would be blowing with the right hand and onto the correct hand. Most of the hands, in Chauvet at least, are left hands. And unless prehistoric people were a lot more likely to be lefties, this means that they probably used their dominant hand for something while blowing out onto their non-dominant hand. Now, this blowing of pigment thing is something that I did actually practice a bit before filming, and this is another case of my hubris in which I thought that, hey, I did it a couple weeks ago, I'll definitely remember exactly how to do it now, with my limited amount of pigment and my first time on the camera setup. I believe I've mentioned my incredibly scuffed recording setup. I'd like to mention that my video recording setup during this time was just as, if not more, scuffed. You see, I was doing these paintings on the outside windowsill of my house, because I don't have access to anything resembling a cave that I would feel okay blowing paint around in. You may be wondering how I got my camera to sit this way in front of the house. Fun fact, the more stilted my speech sounds, the less scripted that part is. Unless I'm getting very emotional, in which case I'm definitely going off script. No, the way I recorded this is I actually got my brother to drive his car up in front of the window, and I put my computer down on it. And then when my computer ran out of battery, I propped my phone up on my computer. Oh, that's another hydration break. Now, the reason I decided to swish out there is because I didn't want any accidental random food or tea particles to get into the paint. Now, here we go. That was my first time trying it with actual pigment. Now, the thing about actual pigment is that it's thicker than water. So it requires a different sort of blowing style. And it's a little more difficult to get the hang of. I did practice with water a long while before this, and it's very easy to make a sort of misty spray with water, but this is not just water. This is water and a bit of egg yolk and a bunch of little charcoal thingies mixed in. So it's, well, gross for one thing. That actually brings me to a comment I had, a thought. I've been having a lot of thoughts while doing this project. The thought is, you can actually tell, with this pigment for blowing it onto the hands, you can tell whether it's been mixed correctly, judging by the way that it tastes. Assuming that one were to be using charcoal or rock dust with a little bit of water and a little bit of egg yolk as a binding agent, although this would also have worked with most other available natural binding agents, considering that most binding agents have a bit of a taste. The ones I listed earlier in the video, egg yolk, animal blood, animal fat, plant juice, animal urine, they would all have a bit of a taste to them. So I wonder if the prehistoric people would have maybe mixed the paint outside or just on the threshold or maybe even right in front of it and tasted a little bit to make sure that they had the right levels of rock or charcoal texture and taste from the pigment and the right level of salt or whatever salt or iron or urine flavor from the binding agent. It would just be another layer of, well, another layer of, what's the word? You can tell this part isn't scripted. It would be another layer of certainty that they have it mixed correctly. Because you have the way it looks, the way it swirls around, the way it drips, and the way it tastes. Now, this would be around the part where I decided that I didn't have enough pigment left to keep practicing with the charcoal. I was just going to mix up the rest of that and do a little bit more mouth position practice and go to town on the rock. As you can see, the rock is already there and I've already sprayed it. That's what the lost footage bit was about. And I decided I would just spray it again because I only have so much pigment and I only have one perfectly hand-sized, hand-shaped rock. There's the last of it. And here's the final part of the black one. Both of the times I did this, I mostly just got the fingers. But that's okay, because the fingers are the most recognizable part of the hand. And most of the paintings in Chauvet Cave... Oh, there's another hydration break. If you're watching this whole thing, whoever you may be, I encourage you to also take hydration breaks whenever I do it in the video. As I was saying, most of the hand paintings, hand sprays, whatever you call them, hand stencils in Chauvet and other caves, they do seem to have a more concentrated spray around the upper part of the hand and the fingers. They usually have a magnificent just... Oh, I'm gonna start fangirling about the Chauvet Cave hand paintings. Here we have the final products and the thing that it was based on. Now, looking at them side by side, I can see everything I possibly did wrong, but I can also see a bit of a resemblance. I did my best to angle it and fade it in over the top so you could sort of see where I'm going at. The angle of the horns are not right, the lines are very thick, but the shape is, well, as I said earlier, the shape isn't quite top-heavy enough, but it's close. This cave bear is doing its best. The lines are very thick, it's not quite long enough, the fading isn't as good as it could have been, but the shape is mostly there. I mean, I sort of think it kinda looks like a bear. You can kinda tell it's supposed to be a bear at the very least. Next up we have the hands. We have the black one and the red one, which I used all the rest of the red dye on. On the other side, I messed it up. It was too liquidy. It tasted too much like rocks, not enough like salty egg yolk weirdness. And I ended up having to mix in the remaining bits of black dye and that brown pigment to make it, to have enough to spray over it. And we have another look at the bison in a more quote-unquote cave-like lighting, because this is in our basement. And another bear doing its best. And now we have the outtakes. Well, I say outtakes, it's more like, well, in this one I'm introducing a little bit of geological diversity into the yard, into the lawn. I don't have to know how to talk anymore, these are the outtakes. Because you don't want to wash rock dust down your kitchen sink drain. This one I'm going to be introducing a little bit more geological diversity, and my hands are full, because one of them is holding the phone and the other one is holding this. Very faint rock dust. I believe that one is the slate dust that my dad had, and it didn't pigmentize. This was another experiencing thoughts moment where I was definitely thinking about the same sky, something generally similar to the same mountains, and this is a nice little walk past everything while it's still drying on the windowsill before we brought it back inside. And then I'm going to end the video and clean up. I lied, I'm not ending the video right there. I would like to thank Travis. No matter what grade I get on this, as I've said, I'm a massive I don't want to say fan because it feels too small scale, fanatic, enthusiast. I am a Chauvet Cave enjoyer. And cave paintings. I loved working on this project, and I had a lot of feelings about it, and I hope this video managed to convey a couple of them at least. And I'd also like to thank Brad, my anthropology professor, for getting me into this, to this extreme degree in the first place. And I'd like to thank anyone else who for some reason thought it would be a good idea to watch this hour-and-a-half odd long video about going into the mountains, grabbing a bunch of rocks I didn't actually end up using, having way too many thoughts, or not even enough thoughts, about prehistoric humans, and painting rocks with my hands and then putting that paint in my mouth and trying to paint my hand on a rock. It's been one of the most times that I have ever had. Easily one of the most semesters ever. Bye.